I recently experienced a major milestone in my life when my oldest daughter calls me up a few months ago to tell me that she is pregnant with my first grandchild. I was ecstatic. And what made the news even better to me is that she told me that she was having a little boy. And that just made it all the better. The reason being is because my entire adult life I've been cursed to an estrogen hell. Two daughters, significant other, even the animals that I've had, dogs, cats, horses, they've all ended up being female. So I was just tickled to find out that I was going to finally have a little boy in my life. Now I wanted to make him and my daughter something special. So I decided to make a bassinet for him. Now I've never made furniture in my life, and I knew that I wanted to make it on the CNC. So I did a lot of research, watched a lot of videos, and I was disappointed to discover there's not a whole lot on the subject as far as from a hobby level. But I did run across a 3D file of a bassinet for Fusion 360. It wasn't near what I wanted, so I kind of reverse engineered it, made it CNC friendly, and kind of come up with my own design. Now, before you ask, and I'm sorry, I don't have any kind of plans for this. I honestly just shot from the hip and built this thing as I went. What you're seeing here is I'm making the headboards, the panels on each end of the bassinet. And in the center of each headboard, I wanted like a raised panel look. And I decided to come up with these inserts that would go in the center of the panel. And I cut them the way as I would a V-carve inlay. The difference between this and what I would normally do is, say in a cutting board, I would generally cut them about 1/4 of an inch deep. But in these, I cut them 1/2 an inch deep, and I'll explain why in a minute. But this is the panel that will be cut for the insert or the inlay that will go into the headboard. Now, if you've ever watched any of my cutting board videos where I put inlays in them, I've always preached the gospel of no glue gap. And you can do that with ingrain because, as I mentioned before, the ingrain is like a sponge and it soaks up the wood, and you can easily seat the inlay down in the pocket with no issues, no glue gap. But now that I'm using side grain here, I did leave, I don't know, a little less than 1/8 of an inch of a glue gap to make sure that the glue had room to settle between the inlay and the pocket. I've had several questions in the past on how I clamp my inlays, and here it is. This is a Harbor Freight shop press that I converted to an inlay press. And the old bottle jack would leak down, so I put a 3-ton scissor jack on it, and it just works great. Now, a minute ago, I mentioned that I made these inlays a half an inch thick. And the reason being is that I made a couple of these before making this video as a test, and they both failed. And the reason being is that I lined the grain up with the insert and the panel, and it warped horribly. And because I had started out cutting down the panel to my ending thickness, which I wanted to be at 3/4 of an inch, I had no room to flatten it back out or surface it. So for this, I started out with the original wood size. I used 4/4 wood, and I put the insert in, the inlay, after surfacing off the excess of the inlay. Over the course of the next few days, I would just surface it down a little bit here and there, let the wood do its thing, warp, surface it down. And by the time I got down to my target thickness, which was 3/4 an inch, the wood had stabilized and it would stay flat. When I was first dreaming this up, I was trying to determine how I was going to attach the headboards to the legs of the bassinet. And my first thought was to use dowels and dowel holes. But I experimented a little bit, and I wanted to use a mortise and tenon. And what I'm doing here is I'm cutting out these little pockets for the tenons on the side of the headboard. I cut these pockets on the back at an eighth of an inch thick, and then I will flip the board over and I will cut matching pockets on the front of it, which are also an eighth of an inch thick, and that should leave me with a half-inch tenon on each side of the panel of the headboard. And as you can see here, my little raised panel look, I cut that using a molding tool path. Turned out pretty good. I was proud of myself. After cutting the pockets, the two pockets on the front and back for the tenon, I did a final profile pass to cut out the headboard. I hate tabs, so I used a down cut bit and turned the dust collection off so the cavity would fill up with sawdust, kind of keep it from shifting. Just as a little added insurance, I put my hand on top there at the end. Couple of passes through the drum sander to get the tool marks out of it. This is from my buddy Derek. Look, Derek, no machines. One down, one to go. These will be the feet for the bassinet, and I wanted them to somewhat match the design of the headboards with an insert in the center of them. This will also be a half an inch deep. I cut the pockets out using a V-carve tool path. I used a half-inch end mill to do the original clearing, and then a 1/8 inch end mill to clean out the little corners that you see. And then, of course, I come back with the engraving bit to finish up the edges. I didn't have enough room here for the design that I used on the headboard for that insert. So I just kind of did just a little channel around the edges as a border. Also used a molding tool path for this as well. And then once all that was done, I cut holes there, as you see. That's where dowel pins will go into to secure the legs to the feet, and then a profile cut to cut it out. I was finally able to make use of my rotary axis to make some parts for this. And here I'm cutting out the pieces that will be the spindles that will go along the bed rails on each side. If you watch my first video, I talked about how I incorporated my rotary into my wasteboard. I didn't want to compromise any of the cutting area, so I cut this little insert out in my wasteboard to accommodate the rotary. And this is how I find zero for the y-axis and the z-axis. I like the center or zero to the center of the rotary. And I come up with this little tool to find zero. And I will set the x-axis. I'll just move it over manually until I have fair clearance between it and the edge to the right of the rotary, and I'll just manually set the zero for x there. Now, despite my best efforts to make this operation as fast as possible, these spindles still ended up being about 45 minutes apiece, and I had 18 of them to cut out. So this took me several days to do in my spare time, but it was worth it to me just to say that I was able to make them myself. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I'd never made furniture before, and on several occasions I have stepped outside my comfort zone. But I'm grateful for it because I learned a lot. And probably one of the biggest things that I learned, and I'm very super proud of, is that I discovered what these are called. Now, before, I would just call them those balls that go on top of a post or a leg. But they actually have a name. They're called finials. So I don't call them the balls that go on top of a post or leg anymore. I call them finials. Now, I'm sitting around having dinner, drinking beer with other woodworkers. I can speak the language and at least pretend like I know what the hell I'm talking about. I will use dowels to connect the legs to the feet as well as the bed bottom to the rails of the bassinet, and they will show. And my first thought was just to use, colored dowels that would be flush with the rest of it, but I come up with this idea to put a button head on the end of the dowels to kind of give it a decorative look. Oops, slippery little suckers. These will be the bed rails that go on each side of the bassinet and that the spindles will attach to. I'm gluing these walnut strips to the top rails to act as trim to match the other walnut on the rest of the bassinet. Man, if it wasn't for my cat-like reflexes, that could have been bad. Now I'll trim all the rails down to length and get ready for the dowel holes. One of these days I'm going to build me one of those fancy assembly tables with dog holes in it. Secure stuff down too, but for now the bed of my CNC works great. And probably the biggest design flaw in this whole project was the spacing for the spindles. I have since discovered that there is actually a safety standard when it comes to baby beds and cribs on the space between the spindles, and that is 2 3/8 inches of space at the most between the spindles. I did not know that, and mine ended up being 2.5 inches of space between the spindles. And that's not a big deal, and the boys' heads are going to be much bigger than that, but it's still a scary thought that if you make something like this, you could unintentionally create something that would hurt a kid. So it spooked me, and I bought a liner that goes around the inside of the bassinet as protection to keep his arms and legs in and whatnot. So if I ever build another one of these, I'll know better, and I will certainly check into the safety specs to make sure that everything's up to par. Now, earlier I mentioned that I was going to attach the headboard to the legs using a mortise and tenon. I'm cutting the mortise out of the side of the legs for the tenon of the headboard to fit into. Now I'm going to use regular store-bought wood dowels to attach the rails to the side of the leg, and I could have manually drilled them, but it was just so much easier and exact to let the machine do it. So these will be the dowel holes for the rails. Now I mentioned earlier I use this cutout for my rotary to install it in, but also it doubles as a vertical cutting area. I built this insert out of MDF to use for that. These will be the dowel holes for the rails where they'll fit into the legs. And I could have drilled these manually, but it's just great insurance to let the machine do it because you know they'll be exact. And this, my dear friends, is what they call the money shot. And I also use this to cut a hole and a contoured area on top of the leg for the finial to fit into, or for you ordinary folks, the ball that goes on top of the post. And I actually created a molding tool path for this. I have fallen in love with molding tool paths here lately. I've discovered there's so much you can do with them if you put your head to it. And that is how you do that. Now, I'm embarrassed to admit that when it come to gluing all this together, I did not put as much thought into it as I needed to. Anything I've ever glued up in the past has been square and obviously easy to put clamps on, but gluing up this angled stuff was pretty difficult. And this is what I come up with off the cuff is I used the bed of my CNC and I cut these tall pieces of PVC to kind of fit the legs in between and hopefully wedge it in there to help hold it, to keep it from moving around. It wasn't the most elegant solution, but thank goodness it ended up working. If I ever build something like this again, I'll come up with a jig of some sort to to glue it up properly. I knew when I ended up having to sand everything that these spindles were going to be a chore. So I'll come up with this little idea. And we have a saying down here in the South, it ain't stupid if it works. Now the dowel on the bottom of the finial was obviously too big to go into the chuck of my drill. So I consider this rocket science level ingenuity here. And one of the biggest worries that I had from the point I drew it up to this point here was that the dowel holes in the legs and the feet wouldn't line up. So I can't even begin to tell you how pleased I was with myself when they lined up perfectly. I cut these dowels a specific length so when they were installed opposite each other, there would be an eighth of an inch clearance between the ends of each dowel, and that would allow for space for glue to settle, but yet still enough of the pin to go into the leg or the feet on each side so it'd secure it properly. Now, using wooden dowels to connect the rails to the side of the legs worked out great, but honestly, if I had it to do over again, I would create a mortise and a tenon, the mortise in the leg and the tenon on the rail to fit like the headboard did inside of the leg. I just think that'd been probably more structurally sound in the end, maybe last several more years, and just more elegant and a little bit of bragging rights. Now, I wanted to point out there's obviously some footage that I have left out because honestly, I forgot to capture some things. One being, if you'll notice the bottom of the legs, the channels and the dowel holes for the feet to fit into. I completely forgot to video that. This YouTubing thing, man, it adds a lot of responsibility and trouble to your project. It almost doubles the project time because you're having to drag a camera around and make sure that you set the camera up and get a good angle and record and stop, and it adds a lot to it. So admittedly, when I'm deep in thought, concentrating on the project, I'll actually forget to video some things. And another thing I forgot to capture is if you notice all these nice rounded edges to all the pieces of the bassinet, I forgot to video myself going over to a friend of mine's house who has a router table to let me borrow that so I could round off these edges. Now, he insisted that I mention him as payment for using his router table, and I did so because I feel sorry for him because he's handicapped. And his name is Mike, and Mike's handicap is that he's bald. Now, I know what you're saying. Scott, bald's not a handicap. There's millions of bald guys walking around, and I know that. And an ordinary bald guy, you wouldn't even think about it. I mean, it's just a normal thing these days to see older guys with bald heads. But Mike's level of baldness is incredible. So much so that if you saw him walking down the street, you'd stop and go, "My God, look at how bald that man is." So I try not to rub it in or point it out. I feel a little sorry for him, but I appreciate you, Mike. Thank you for all that you do, despite your shortcomings. And thank you for letting me use your router table. There, I mentioned you. You happy? Now, I waited until I had the rest of the bassinet glued up before I measured and cut out the panel that would be the bed bottom. I just want to make sure what the ending measurements would be. Again, this was my first project like this. I didn't expect it to go perfect, and it didn't. I mean, mistakes were made, and it wasn't dead on accurate each measurement, but it was close enough. And that way I knew once I cut the bed bottom out, the bed panel, that it would be where it needed to be. And believe it or not, I have a planer. It ain't no high dollar planer, but I use my machine to plane and surface most everything nowadays because it's just so much more accurate and just easier. Now, I'm here to tell you the absolute best tool in your shop that you could ever have is one that you borrowed from a friend. These panels were too big for me to try to cut a glue line cut on my table saw, so my buddy let me borrow his Festool track saw. And let me tell you something, that thing is bad to the bone. It cut a perfectly straight cut to where I could glue these panels up. Thanks, Jeremy. Now, I'm not going to talk trash about Jeremy like I did Mike, because though Jeremy has been a lifelong friend, he is also my employer. So I've got to kiss a little butt when I can, right? Besides, Jeremy has his own problems because he has a very high maintenance and needy wife named Rhonda. And Jeremy has enough on his plate dealing with that, so I don't want to add to it. And once I got the panel for the bed glued up and surfaced out, I cut the bed out using a profile cut on the machine. Now the next step I got to do is I'll do a test fit inside the bassinet because I'm gonna have to cut the edges of the bed panel to match the angle of the rails, which are 10 degrees. And once I had it in, I got an idea how much I needed to cut, and I just used a track saw to cut an angle in it, and I snuck up on it until I got it right. I actually bought myself a nice set of chisels for this project because I knew I would have to chisel out some edges and corners, and in this case, I'd have to match the angle of the rest of the bed in this little corner here. And I have quickly developed a deep appreciation for those guys who do such beautiful chisel work. It is indeed an art. I'm not good at it, but I'm pretty pleased with myself. This one didn't turn out half bad. And one thing that I promise I'm going to work on is doing better with my camera angles so I don't get my big fat head or hand in the way. It's a difficult thing to get a angle in a very tight spot like this where you can still see everything, but I still have room to work. So forgive the horrible cinematography. These are going to be the dowel holes for the pins to fit through that go into the bed panel. And my thought is that I made them long enough to where almost a half an inch of that pin goes into the bed panel to help hold it to the rest of the bassinet. And once I got the bed positioned, I re-drilled the original dowel holes and then drilled into the bed panel for the dowels to slide into. And one thing you're going to notice is these holes, the way I got the bed positioned, is the dowel hole started at the bottom of the panel on the edge there. And my thought was that once I put the dowel pin through at the angle that it's at, that is going to protrude further up towards the middle of the bed panel. If I'd have done it from the middle, then it would have been closer to the top, and I just felt like it would be more structurally sound if I started the holes at the bottom to give more meat, if you will, of the wood to set on the dowels down the rail. And then once I got it positioned, I just kind of stuck 4 dowels in on each corner to hold it in position while I got the other dowels glued up, and it would be lined up properly for them to just slide on in. Now, it can never be said that if this glue up failed because I didn't have enough clamps on it. One thing I wanted to do before I got the finish sanding done was, I don't know, just put a nice little touch to it. I bought this little laser specifically for jobs like this. I don't have a large laser. This is the only laser I have. And it's more than just cute. I mean, it's pretty functional. It does a wonderful job. I paid $150 for it, and I usually use it to engrave my little woodworking logo into things, but this was just a little message that I want to put on there for my grandkid. And then the fun begins. Have I ever mentioned how much I hate sanding? Before I put everything together, I sanded everything down with anywhere from 120 to 180 grit. And then once I got everything glued together, I finished it off with 220. And before I sealed it, I used a little denatured alcohol to wipe everything down to get any residual dust or my grimy fingerprints off of it before I sealed it. And I use Rubio Monocoat for the sealing. If you've never used it, I highly recommend it. It's pricey, but that stuff is awesome, man. It just it's easy to apply, and it just makes the wood pop. And it's kind of like Brill cream. A little dab of do you. I'm talking a little bit of go a long way too. So there you have it. My first furniture build for my first ever grandchild. It was a daunting task. It was not without its headaches, but I'm very proud of it. In this journey of woodworking, it has really, really just become a huge part of my life. I love it. I love creating things. I wish I had this inspiration 30 years ago. Who knows where I would be now. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. I hope you enjoyed it. And I want to leave you with the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen. Thank you all, and God bless.